The Sioux are one of the largest and oldest Native American tribes in North America, dating back 2,000 or 3,000 years. With a territory that spanned thousands of square miles at the peak of their strength, the Sioux are one of the most well-known and influential tribes in the history of the United States. Origins. The ancestral Sioux most likely lived in the central Mississippi Valley region, and later in Minnesota. Shortly before 800 A.D., the Sioux arrived in the northwoods of central Minnesota and northwestern Wisconsin from the central Mississippi River. Around 1300 A.D., they adopted the characteristics of a northern tribal society and became known as the Seven Council Fires. Within the Seven Council Fires were 7 bands. These are the original bands. They are based on kinship, dialect, and geographic proximity. There are now various groups who descend from the original 7 and maintain autonomy over the governing of their tribe. The 3 largest subsets of the Sioux Nation are the Lakota, Nakota, and Dakota. Keep in mind that some historians believe the Nakota were part of the Dakota. These are also the 3 main languages spoken among the Sioux. In any of the dialects, Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota translates to friend or ally, referring to the alliances between the bands. Like other native tribes, the Sioux believe animals are relatives. They feel a special bond among all living things, plants, animals, spirits, and people. It is believed that the Great Spirit created the universe and embodies everything in the universe as one. Their primary cultural prophet is the White Buffalo Calf Woman, who came as an intermediary between the Great Spirit and humankind, to teach them how to be good relatives by introducing the 7 sacred rites and the sacred pipe. The 7 ceremonies are the Purification Lodge, Crying for Vision, the Sun Dance, Making of Relatives, the Female Puberty Ceremony, Throwing of the Ball, and Soul Keeping. The Sioux Way of Life. Before the 1600s, the Dakota lived in the area around Lake Superior, where they hunted wild rice and other foods, hunted deer and buffalo, and speared fish from canoes. But during the 1700s, warfare with the Ojibwa tribe to their east drove the Dakota into what is now southern and western Minnesota, at that time the territory of the agricultural Lakota and Nakota. After that, the Lakota and Nakota moved to what are now states of North and South Dakota. As horses were becoming common on the plains during this period, the Lakota and Nakota abandoned agriculture in favor of a lifestyle centered on the nomadic hunting of buffalo. Traditionally, the Lakota and Nakota shared many cultural characteristics with other nomadic plains native societies. They lived in teepees, wore clothing made from leather, suede, or fur, and traded buffalo products for corn, produced by the farming tribes of the plains. The Sioux also raided those tribes frequently, particularly the Mandan, Arikara, Hidatsa, and Pawnee, actions that eventually drove these tribes to ally themselves with the U.S. military against the Sioux later. Sioux culture. In the past, the Sioux lived in camps of larger and extended families that are connected with a sense of community. An appointed leader would create a deep understanding of identity and belonging for the camp. Life in these communities centered around daily subsistence tasks divided by age and gender. Hunting, warfare, and making tools and weapons were the responsibilities of men, with time left over for trading, councils, ceremonies, and leisure activities, such as horse races. Women's responsibilities including gathering wild resources, such as prairie turnips, processing and tanning hides, cooking, sewing, quill work, and managing the daily needs of the household. Women were responsible for breaking camp, packing belongings on travois, and setting up camp again at the end of the day. Older children and youth frequently had responsibility for gathering firewood and water and tending to horses and dogs. Grandparents and elders were often entrusted with the primary responsibility of caring for small children and infants and assisting with household tasks. In Lakota society, men were allowed to have more than one wife, and men of high status frequently had several wives. First contacts with settlers and relations with the Ojibwa. In the 1600s, the Dakota Sioux traded with French merchants, as also other tribes did at the time. The French were trying to gain advantage in the struggle for the North American fur trade against the English. The Ojibwa, Potawatomi, and Ottawa bands were among the first to trade with the French. The first recorded encounter between the Sioux and the French occurred when explorers Radisson and Groseilliers reached what is now Wisconsin during the winter of 1659 to 1660. The relationship between the Sioux and the Ojibwa was a complicated one. In 1679, the Sioux and the Ojibwa formed an alliance through peaceful diplomacy at Fond du Lac in present-day Minnesota. The Ojibwe agreed to provide the Sioux with fur trade goods, and in return the Sioux permitted the Ojibwe to move west toward the Mississippi River. During this period of peace that lasted for 57 years, the Ojibwa and Sioux often hunted together, created families together, shared their religious experiences, and prospered. Over time, the Dakota began to resent the Ojibwa trading with their hereditary enemies, the Cree and Assiniboine, with whom they were at war. The French also added to the fallout by playing both sides. Tensions rose in the 1720s and spilled into a war in 1736. The Sioux no longer needed the Ojibwa to supply them with trade goods. They began to resent the Ojibwa presence in their lands. The Ojibwa, having lived there for almost 3 generations, were not about to leave. They decided to fight for the territory they had originally entered in as guests. The Sioux-Ojibwa War that started in 1736 was to evolve into one of the most long-lasting wars in North American history. It soon stretched along a standing front from central Wisconsin through Minnesota to the Red River of the north. By blocking all travel and trade across this line, the war had a major effect on the fur trade. It redirected traders to safer, more northern routes, much to the satisfaction of the Cree and Ojibwa. It blocked off European access to the Sioux market. Soon the Ojibwe spread out to occupy the waterways from Grand Portage to Rainy Lake, with their main town at the latter spot. From there they started pushing south toward the Sioux settlements at Leech, Red, and Sandy Lakes. Before 40 years were up, all of northern Minnesota would be theirs. One of the larger battles between the Sioux and Ojibwa took place in 1770, fought at the Dalles of the St. Croix. According to William Whipple Warren, a Métis historian, the fighting began when the Meskwaki tribe engaged the Ojibwa, their hereditary enemies, around St. Croix Falls. The Dakota were the former enemies of the Meskwaki, but were enlisted to make a joint attack against the Ojibwa. The Meskwaki were first to engage with the large Ojibwa war party. The Meskwaki allegedly boasted to the Dakota to hold back, as they would make short work of their enemies. When the Sioux joined the battle, they had the upper hand until Ojibwe reinforcements arrived. While the Sioux and Ojibwe suffered heavy losses, the Meskwaki were left with the most dead. The Ojibwe emerged victorious and secured control of the upper St. Croix that created an informal boundary between the Sioux and Ojibwe around the mouth of the Snake River. The Dakota Sioux lost their traditional lands around Leech Lake and Mille Lacs, as they were forced south along the Mississippi River and St. Croix River Valley as a result of the battles. As the Lakota and Nakota Sioux moved west and entered the prairies, they adopted many of the customs of the neighboring Plains tribes, creating new cultural patterns based on the horse and fur trade. Meanwhile, the Dakota Sioux retained many of their woodlands features. By 1803, the 3 divisions of the Sioux, Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota, were established in their different environments and had developed their own distinctive lifeways. However, due to the same cultural aspects, the 3 divisions maintained strong ties. Life and war in the West. Having suffered from the encroachment of the Ojibwa, the Sioux were extremely resistant to incursions upon their new territory. This territory was increasingly broached as the colonial frontier moved westward past the Mississippi River in the mid-19th century. The California gold rush of 1849 opened a floodgate of travelers, and many Sioux became cautious by the U.S. government's attempt to establish the Bozeman Trail and other routes through the tribe's sovereign lands. In 1851, the signing of the Fort Laramie Treaty happened. This treaty allowed safe passage for settlers along the Oregon Trail. It was an unfortunate incident that broke the peace.